For 60 years, the whole galaxy held its breath waiting for the Perdita to come back and kill us all. That's not me being dramatic. That's the actual policy of 11 separate governments, written down in real documents I've read with my own eyes. Contingency plans, evacuation routes. Standing fleets kept fueled and ready for 60 years against the day the lost human ship returned. Because everyone knew, everyone was certain, that when the Perdita came home, it would come home as a monster. They were wrong. God, they were so wrong. And I was there on the observation deck of Relay Station Kesh, the day the Perdita finally came out of the dark. I saw the whole thing. I saw the galaxy realize its mistake. And I've spent the rest of my life trying to explain to people what really happened, because the version everyone believes is a lie. And the truth is so much stranger and so much sadder and, in the end, so much more beautiful than the lie ever was. Let me start from before I was born, because that's really where this begins. The Perdita left Earth 2 years before I was born. I need you to understand the Perdita first, what she was, what she meant, because everything hangs on it. Humanity, back then, was new to the stars. We'd been out among the older races for maybe a century, and it had been a hard century. We'd found the galaxy already full, already carved up between powers that were ancient and vast and mostly indifferent to us. We weren't hated, exactly. We were just small and late and unimportant, and the galaxy let us know it in 1,000 small ways every single day. We got the bad trade routes and the poor colony worlds and the seats at the back of every room. I want to give you a taste of what that was like, because it's easy to say the galaxy looked down on us and let it slide past. Let me make it concrete. When I was a child, my mother took me to a Concordance administrative station to petition for a medical transit permit. My little brother had a lung condition and needed treatment we couldn't get on our colony. And we waited. That's the thing I remember. We waited 11 hours in a corridor, on a hard bench, my brother wheezing beside me, while species after species walked past us to the front of the line. Ancient races. Established races. And every time my mother stood up to ask if it was our turn, the clerk, some cold administrator behind a desk, would look at her with this patient, faintly amused expression, the expression you'd give a child who keeps asking when dinner is, and say, "Humans are processed at the end of the cycle. Please be seated." At the end of the cycle. Always the end of the cycle. We got the permit, eventually, after 11 hours, and my brother got his treatment. But I never forgot that expression. Faintly amused. Like our need was a small, quaint thing, not quite real, the way a child's tears aren't quite real to a tired adult. That was what it was to be human in the galaxy back then. Not hated, just small, just always at the end of the cycle. And a whole people can carry that, the way I carried that corridor for the rest of my life. This quiet, permanent ache of being unimportant in a universe that had already decided you didn't matter much. And humanity, being humanity, decided to do something about it. We decided to build a ship. Not a warship. That's important. That's the most important thing, maybe, in this whole story. The Perdita wasn't a weapon. She was the opposite of a weapon. She was our hand extended in friendship, our best foot forward, the thing we built to show the galaxy who we really were. Because we'd had that argument as a species. I've read the histories. When humanity decided to make its great statement to the galaxy, to build the one grand ship that would say we are here and we matter, there were people, loud, powerful people, who said it should be a warship, a show of force. A thing that would make the older races respect us because they feared us. That's how the galaxy respects you, they argued. Not through kindness, through strength. Build a weapon and make them afraid. And humanity said no. That's the part that still moves me when I think about it. A small, poor, disrespected people, aching to matter, arguing about how to announce themselves to a galaxy that looked down on them, and choosing, in the end, not the weapon but the love letter. Choosing to say this is who we are, not with guns but with everything good in us. It was maybe the proudest decision our species ever made, and almost nobody remembers that we made it. that it was a choice, that we could have built a monster and chose to build a marvel instead. My grandmother was part of that decision. She used to say it was the only time in her life she'd been truly proud to be human, not because we were strong, but because when we finally had the chance to be feared, we chose to be known instead. The Perdita was an exploration and diplomatic vessel, the grandest thing humanity had ever made, and we poured everything into her. The best of our science, the best of our art, crews chosen not just for skill but for character, the kindest, the wisest, the most curious people we had. She carried scientists and diplomats and doctors and teachers. She carried seeds and music and libraries. She was meant to sail out past the edge of settled space, into the deep unknown, and make first contact with whatever she found out there, and show them that humanity was a people worth knowing. She was our love letter to the universe. That's how my grandmother described her, and my grandmother helped build her. Our love letter to the universe. 10,000 of the best of us sailing into the dark to say hello. And she vanished. 6 months out past the last relay in the deep black where our sensors couldn't follow, the Perdita went silent. One day there were regular transmissions, cheerful ones, reports of strange stars and stranger discoveries. And the next day, nothing. No distress call, no wreckage, no final message. Just silence, sudden and total, as if the greatest ship humanity ever built had simply been erased from the universe. I've heard those last transmissions, all of them. They're preserved in the human archives, and part of my grandmother's grief, part of what she gave me, was making sure I heard them, all of them, so that someone in the next generation would carry the Perdita's actual voice and not just the story of it. And I want to tell you what's in them, because it matters for everything that comes after. They're happy. That's the unbearable thing. The last transmissions from the Perdita are the happiest recordings in human history. The crew had found things out there, strange gentle stars, a region of space unlike anything in the settled galaxy, a quiet in the deep dark that they described over and over as peaceful. The final transmission, the very last one before the silence, is from a crew member, a young botanist, one of the people who'd brought the seeds, and she's describing the view, the deep still dark ahead of them, and she says, and I have it memorized, she says, it's the most restful thing any of us have ever seen. We keep coming to the gallery just to look at it. Nobody wants to turn back. It feels like, I don't know how to say it, it feels like something out there is glad we came. And then nothing. That was the last thing. It feels like something out there is glad we came. For 60 years, humanity heard that as the last words of the doomed. The final happy message from people who were about to die, who'd sailed cheerfully into a horror they didn't understand. It was the saddest recording in existence, precisely because it was so happy. The happiness of people walking off a cliff in the dark, smiling, right up until the fall. That's how we heard it, for 60 years. We had no idea we were hearing it wrong. We searched, of course, for years. Humanity poured what little it had into looking for the Perdita and found nothing, not a scrap, not a trace. 10,000 people and the finest ship we'd ever built, gone without an echo. Eventually the search wound down because you can't search forever, and the Perdita passed into memory, into grief, into the particular ache of a wound that never gets to heal because it never gets an answer. I grew up in the shadow of that grief. Everyone my age did. The Perdita was the great sorrow of human history, our reaching out that got answered with silence, and there was a whole generation of us raised on the story of the beautiful ship that sailed into the dark and never came home. My grandmother would tell me about the people she'd known aboard her. She'd nearly been chosen for the crew herself, and hadn't been, and had spent her whole life not knowing whether to be grateful or heartbroken about it. She'd tell me about the Perdita and she'd cry, even 50 years later, and I never fully understood the depth of it until much later. I have to tell you about my grandmother, because she's the reason I am who I am, and the reason I did what I did on the day the ship came home. Her name was Amara, and she was an engineer, one of the thousands who built the Perdita, and she'd been one of the final candidates for the crew. They chose the crew carefully. I told you, character mattered as much as skill, and my grandmother made it all the way to the last round and then wasn't chosen. And she never knew why. A younger engineer got the place she'd wanted, and my grandmother stayed on Earth, and 2 years later my mother was born, which wouldn't have happened if Amara had sailed. So I quite literally owed my existence to her not being chosen, and she knew that. And it tangled her grief into a knot that never came undone. She'd survived because she was rejected. 10,000 of the best of humanity sailed into the dark and died, or so we thought, and she wasn't good enough to go with them, and that rejection was the only reason her whole family line existed. How do you hold that? How do you grieve people whose deaths you were spared by being told you weren't good enough to join them? She held it by talking about them. Constantly. She kept them alive the only way she could, by making sure I knew them. The botanist with the seeds, the old doctor who'd volunteered at 70, the 2 teachers who'd married the week before launch, all of them, names and faces and stories, 10,000 people she made me learn like family. Someone has to remember them as people, she told me, not as a tragedy. A tragedy is a thing that happened. People are who they were. Don't you dare let them become just a thing that happened. I never did. I carried them my whole life. And on the day the ship came home, when the galaxy wanted to destroy it, it was those 10,000 people, not the tragedy, but the people, the botanist and the doctor and the married teachers. It was knowing them as people that let me do what I did. My grandmother spent 50 years making sure I knew the crew of the Perdita as human beings. She didn't know she was preparing me to save them, but she was. So that's the human side, the love letter that vanished, the grief we carried, the old woman who kept 10,000 ghosts alive at her kitchen table. But the galaxy remembered it differently. Here's what happened out there in the wider galaxy in the years after the Perdita disappeared. And this is the part humans mostly didn't know, because nobody bothered to tell us, because we were small and unimportant and nobody explained anything to us. Other things had gone missing in that same region of deep space. Not human things, alien things, ships from the older races, expeditions into the deep dark beyond the settled galaxy. They'd been vanishing for a very long time, long before humanity ever reached the stars. That region of space had a name among the old races, a name that translated roughly as the Quiet. And the Quiet was where ships went to disappear. Nobody knew why. Nobody who went deep into the Quiet ever came back to explain. It was the galaxy's oldest ghost story, its deepest fear, the dark at the edge of the map where the monsters were. And humanity, in its ignorance, in its hope, in its reaching out, humanity had sailed the Perdita straight into the Quiet. Nobody warned us. Or if they did, we didn't listen because we were young and proud and certain. And the Perdita went into the Quiet and did what everything that went into the Quiet did. She vanished. I've thought a lot about the fact that nobody warned us, and I've come to a hard conclusion about it, which is that some of them wanted us to go in. Not all. Most of the galaxy simply didn't care enough about humans to think our route worth commenting on. But some in the Concordance, the ones who ruled, I think some of them saw where the Perdita was headed and said nothing and were glad. Because a human ship vanishing into the Quiet served them. It taught the upstart species its place. It gave the galaxy one more story about the horror in the dark. It was useful. Our grief was useful to them. That's a thing I learned much later, and it still makes me cold to think about. That the great sorrow of my people, the 10,000 best of us lost, was to certain powers not a tragedy at all but a convenient demonstration. But here's where the galaxy's fear comes in, because a few things had come out of the Quiet over the long ages, not many, but a few, ships that had gone in whole and come out changed, wrong. The crews gone or transformed into something that wasn't quite alive and wasn't quite dead. Vessels that came drifting back out of the dark carrying things that had to be destroyed on sight, because whatever the Quiet did to what went into it, what came back was always hostile, always a horror, always a thing that had to be put down before it spread. So when the Perdita went into the quiet, the galaxy didn't grieve her the way we did. The galaxy started counting down, because in their experience, ships didn't just vanish in the quiet. Sometimes they came back, and when they came back as weapons, as plagues, as monsters wearing the shape of what they used to be. The galaxy looked at our love letter and saw a bomb with a very long fuse. And they settled in to wait for it to go off. I learned all this slowly growing up. My family had connections. My grandmother's work on the Perdita had given us a place, small but real, in the human government's orbit, and I grew up half in the human world of grief and half in the galactic world of fear. And the two never matched. To humans, the Perdita was a tragedy, a loss, a beautiful thing taken from us. To everyone else, the Perdita was a threat that hadn't materialized yet, a countdown that hadn't hit zero. I remember the first time I really understood the gap. I was maybe 14, and I was at a mixed gathering. My grandmother had taken me, wanting me to learn to move between species, already shaping me toward what I'd become. And I mentioned the Perdita to an older alien, some minor concordance functionary, mentioned it the way a human would, with that reflexive grief. And the functionary looked at me with something I couldn't read and said, "You speak of it fondly. That is strange to us. You understand it will return as a contamination event, that we will have to destroy it." And I said, 14 years old, stunned, "Destroy it. Those are our people, 10,000 of our people." And the functionary said mildly, "They are not your people anymore. Whatever comes out of the quiet is not what went in. When your ship returns, it will not be your people. It will be a thing wearing their memory. And it will have to be burned." And then it went back to its conversation, having explained to a human child that her people's greatest grief was, from where the galaxy stood, an unexploded bomb we were sentimentally attached to. That was the day I understood that humanity and the galaxy were not grieving the same event. We were mourning a death. They were dreading a birth, and nobody on either side understood the other at all. Which, I suppose, is why I became what I became. I became a translator. That was my work. I had a gift for languages, human and alien both, and more than that, I had a gift for the thing underneath language, the thing where two peoples who don't understand each other need someone standing in the middle. I want to explain what that work actually is, because it's the heart of who I am, and it's why the story ends the way it ends. Translation isn't really about words. Anyone can learn words. There are machines that do words. Real translation, the kind that matters, is about standing in the space between two peoples who fear and misunderstand each other, and carrying meaning across that space without letting it curdle into the fear. It's about hearing what someone is afraid of underneath what they're saying, and finding the way to say it to the other side, so that it lands as a person speaking and not a threat. It's the loneliest work in the galaxy, because you belong fully to neither side. You spend your life in the cold space between peoples, the space everyone else hurries across, the space you make your home. And it's the most necessary work, because without someone in that space, the fear just grows and grows, until two peoples who might have been friends destroy each other over a misunderstanding no one stayed to untangle. I was good at it. I'd been training for it my whole life without knowing, raised by a grandmother who lived in the space between grief and gratitude, who taught me to hold two irreconcilable things at once, who made me learn 10,000 ghosts as people. I understood the space between. It was where I'd always lived. It made me useful. It got me a posting at Relay Station Kesh, which sat right at the edge of settled space, the last outpost before the deep dark, the closest human-crewed station to the quiet itself. Which is how I came to be standing on the observation deck of Kesh, 60 years after the Perdita vanished, on the day she came back. Let me set that day for you, because the details matter and I remember all of them. Kesh was a big station, a coordination hub where humans and a dozen older races worked together, monitoring the edge of the settled galaxy, watching the dark. It was one of the few genuinely mixed places in known space, humans and aliens living and working side by side. And I loved it for that, because the space between peoples was where I'd spent my whole life, and Kesh was a station built entirely out of that space. I'd been there 11 years, long enough that it was home, long enough that I'd stopped being the human translator and become just part of the station, one of the fixtures, the person everyone came to when a negotiation snagged on something deeper than words. I had a life there. A small apartment with a real window, which was a luxury. A handful of friends across 3 species. A standing dinner every 10th day with an Ordini linguist named Teppa, who was the closest thing I had to a best friend. A gentle scholar who found human languages delightfully imprecise, and meant it as the highest compliment. I mentioned Teppa because she was on the deck that day too, and because her being there mattered later in a small way. But mostly I mention her because I want you to understand that I had a whole ordinary rich life at Kesh, that I wasn't waiting for anything, that the day the Perdita came home found me in the middle of a life I loved and had no wish to have interrupted. That morning was ordinary. I remember I'd had a disagreement with a Threnody trade delegate over the exact meaning of a contract term. The Threnody were sticklers, precise to the point of madness, and I'd spent an hour teasing apart a single word with their representative. It was the kind of work I loved, actually, the fine, careful untangling of meaning, and I remember being a little pleased with how it had gone, having found the exact phrasing that satisfied the Threnady's precision without losing the human party's intent. A good morning's work in the space between. I remember the observation deck was busy, the usual mix of species going about the usual business. I remember the coffee was good that day, which was rare. Kesh's recyclers usually produced something closer to warm regret than coffee, and I'd gotten a second cup and taken it to the big viewport to drink it while I looked out at the stars, at the edge of the dark, at the quiet that sat out there beyond the last relay like a held breath. I did that sometimes, stood at the viewport and looked at the quiet. Everyone at Kesh did, I think, though nobody talked about it. It was right there, the great fear, the dark at the edge of the map, close enough that we were the ones who'd see it first if anything ever came out. And I'd stand there with my coffee and think about the Perdita, somewhere in that dark, 60 years gone, and I'd think about the botanist's last words. It feels like something out there is glad we came. And I'd feel the old grief, worn smooth now by a lifetime of carrying it. And I'd wonder, the way everyone at Kesh secretly wondered, whether today would be the day the countdown finally hit 0. That day it was. And then the alarm started. Not the ordinary alarms, a specific alarm, one I'd heard only in drills, one that every station at the edge of settled space had, one that in 60 years had never once sounded for real. The Perdita Protocol. I dropped my coffee. I actually dropped it. The cup shattered on the deck and I didn't even look down because I knew that sound. Everyone at Kesh knew that sound. We drilled it 100 times and prayed we'd never hear it. And now it was screaming through the station, and it meant only one thing. I want you to understand what that alarm meant, because the whole galaxy's fear was encoded in it. The Perdita Protocol was the galaxy's contingency for the day the lost human ship came back. It was a coordinated response involving 11 governments, developed over decades, refined and drilled and kept ready. And it had exactly one purpose: to destroy the Perdita the moment she emerged from the quiet, before she could get close to anything, before whatever she'd become could spread. When that alarm sounded, it meant one thing: something had come out of the quiet, and the automated systems had identified it from 60-year-old records as the Perdita. The observation deck went silent. Then it erupted. I remember a Threnody delegate making a sound I'd never heard, a high keening that the translators couldn't render. I remember a human officer shouting into a comm. I remember Teppa, my gentle linguist friend, going very still beside me, her hand finding my arm. And I remember the station's commander, a tall, grave being called Administrator Sol, of a race called the Ordeni, giving orders in a voice gone flat with dread. And I remember standing frozen at the viewport with my shattered coffee cup at my feet, staring out at the dark, because somewhere out there, coming toward us, was my grandmother's love letter, the great grief of my whole people, the beautiful lost ship, the botanist, the doctor, the married teachers, 10,000 people I knew by name because an old woman at a kitchen table refused to let them become just a tragedy. And every gun in 11 governments was about to open fire on it. They scrambled the fleet. That fast. The standing Perdita fleet, dozens of warships from a dozen races, kept fueled and ready for 60 years for exactly this. They launched within minutes, moving to intercept, to form a wall between the emerging ship and the settled galaxy. And I watched them go, streaking out from Kesh toward the edge of the dark, and something broke loose in me. Because for 60 years the Perdita Protocol had been an abstraction, a drill, a grim hypothetical. And now it was real, and it wasn't a monster the fleet was flying out to kill. It was the botanist with the seeds. It was the doctor who'd volunteered at 70. It was the 2 teachers who'd married the week before launch. My grandmother's ghosts, made flesh again after 60 years, coming home. And the galaxy was going to murder them at the door without so much as a word, because the galaxy had never once bothered to learn their names. I grabbed Teppa's arm. "They can't," I said. "Those are people, those are our people. They can't just—" And Teppa, gentle Teppa, looked at me with terrible sadness and said my name quietly, and she said, "They think it is a monster. They have thought so for 60 years. And they are very afraid. Fear does not stop to learn names." And she was right, and I knew she was right, and I understood that I was about to watch the galaxy murder the Perdita, 60 years too late to save her and 60 years too early to understand her, and there was nothing I could do about it. Except then the Perdita came out of the quiet, and everyone got their first look at her, and everything stopped. She was beautiful. That was the first wrong thing. That was the thing that broke the whole script, because a monster is supposed to look like a monster. Everything that had ever come out of the quiet had come out wrong, twisted, corrupted, obviously and visibly horrifying. That was the pattern. That was what 60 years of fear had prepared everyone for. A dark thing, a dead thing, a wrong thing. And instead, the Perdita came out of the dark looking more beautiful than the day she left. She was whole. She was gleaming. Her hull, which should have been battered by 60 years in the deep dark, was pristine. More than pristine, it seemed to glow faintly, a soft, warm light that came from within, as if the ship itself were lit up from the inside by something gentle. She was exactly as I'd seen her in the old images my grandmother kept, the grand and lovely shape of her, humanity's finest hour, except somehow more so. As if the 60 years had polished her instead of scarring her, as if wherever she'd been, it had loved her. I heard myself make a sound. I don't know what sound. Teppa's hand tightened on my arm because I knew that shape. I'd grown up with that shape. My grandmother had a model of the Perdita on her shelf, and I'd held it 1,000 times as a child, traced the lines of it, and here was the real thing, 60 years and a lifetime later, coming out of the dark exactly as I'd held it in my hands, but glowing, but somehow more alive than any ship had a right to be. It was like seeing a photograph of a dead loved one suddenly turn its head and smile at you. It was wonderful and it was terrifying, and it broke something open in my chest that had been closed and aching my whole life. The fleet held its fire. I found out later this wasn't an order. It was just a hesitation. 100 gunners across a dozen ships all pausing at once, all looking at this beautiful glowing thing that was supposed to be a monster, and all unable to make themselves pull the trigger on something so lovely. It's a strange thing, but I've come to believe it saved everyone. If she'd come out looking like a horror, they'd have destroyed her in an instant, and everything after would never have happened. She came out looking like grace itself, and it bought just enough hesitation for what came next. Because then the Perdita transmitted. The message came in on every frequency at once, in 100 languages, human and alien both, and it was, I have to be careful how I describe this, Because it's the part people find hardest to believe. It was warm. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't the cold, dead signal of a corrupted ship. It wasn't a horror. It was a greeting, and it was gentle, and it was so full of something like love that half the beings on the observation deck started crying before the translators had even finished rendering it, crying at a feeling that came through underneath the words, a feeling that no monster could possibly have sent. I felt it before I heard the words. That's the thing I can't fully explain. The transmission carried something under it, beneath the language in the space where I'd spent my whole life working, and what it carried was the exact opposite of a threat. It was the feeling of the botanist's last words. It feels like something out there is glad we came, except now it was aimed at us. Something was glad we'd come. Something out there in that ship was so glad, so tender, so full of a homecoming joy 60 years deep, that grown beings who'd braced their whole careers for a monster stood on the deck of Kesh and wept. The message said, "This is the Perdita. We have been away a long time. We know you were afraid. We understand why. We have come home to tell you that you do not need to be afraid anymore, not of us and not of the quiet and not of the thing you have feared out here in the dark for longer than any of you have been alive. We have been where the lost ships go. We know what happened to them. We know what happened to us. And we have come home to explain and to help and to give you back the thing the quiet has been taking from you for 10,000 years. Please, lower your weapons. Let us come home. We have so much to tell you." And the whole galaxy, listening, did not know what to do, because this was not in any of the plans. There was no protocol for a monster that came home beautiful and spoke of love. 60 years of preparation, 11 governments, a standing fleet, all of it built for a horror, and the thing that emerged from the dark was the gentlest voice anyone had ever heard. Administrator Saul, the station commander, the grave Ordeni, he was the one who had to decide. The fleet was his to command in that moment. The Perdita protocol put him in charge of the response, and the protocol was clear: destroy the ship. That was the order 60 years of fear had written. Destroy it, whatever it looks like, whatever it says, because the quiet is cunning and its horrors wear gentle masks, and the only safe lost ship is a destroyed one. I knew Saul, not well but enough. He was old even for an Ordeni, grave and careful and deeply decent in the particular way of beings who have held authority long enough to fear it. He'd run Kesh for 30 years. He'd built the mixed station into something that actually worked, humans and aliens side by side, and he'd done it because he believed, quietly, without ever quite saying so, that the galaxy's coldness between peoples was a wound and not a law. He was, in his own grave way, a man of the space between, like me. Which is maybe why he did what he did next. Because I watched Saul stand there on the deck, this ancient grave being, with the order in front of him and his finger on the trigger of a dozen warships, and I watched him not give the command. The protocol had a time limit. That's the thing people don't know. The Perdita protocol didn't just authorize destruction. It required it, within a set window, precisely so that no commander could hesitate, could be swayed, could do what Saul was doing right now. The galaxy had known, 60 years ago, that a clever horror might come home wearing a gentle face, and they'd written the protocol to take the choice away from whoever was on watch. Destroy it fast before it can talk you out of it. And Saul was standing there letting the window run, second by second, the automated systems surely flashing at him, the other captains surely waiting for the order that the protocol said he had to give. And he didn't give it. Instead he turned, and he looked around the observation deck. And his eyes found me, the human translator, the one person on the deck whose whole life had been spent standing in the space between peoples. And he said, "Translator, you are human. That is your ship, your people's ship." A pause. "Tell me what to do, not as a human wanting to save it, as someone who stands between us. Is that a monster, or is it what it says it is?" And the whole deck went silent, and every eye turned to me. And I understood that the answer to the galaxy's oldest fear had just been placed in my hands, and that I had about 10 seconds to decide whether to trust the most beautiful and terrifying thing I had ever seen. I want to tell you what I did, but first I have to tell you how I decided, because the deciding is the whole thing. I couldn't know. That's the truth. I had no way to be certain. The message was warm, yes, but the galaxy's whole warning was that the Quiet's horrors wore gentle masks. Maybe this was the most cunning monster of all. Maybe the beauty and the warmth were the bait, and the moment we lowered our weapons, the thing wearing the Perdita's face would show its true self, and it would be too late for everyone. I couldn't know. Nobody could know. That was exactly the trap the Quiet had always set. And if I was wrong, if I said, "Let them come home," and it was a horror, then I would be the human who used her position in the space between to talk the galaxy into lowering its guard against the very thing it had feared for 10,000 years. I would be the greatest fool and the greatest traitor in history. Everyone on Kesh would die, and it would be my doing, and the galaxy's fear of humanity would be proven right forever. I felt the weight of that, all of it, in about 10 seconds. But here's what I thought in those 10 seconds, with the whole galaxy waiting. I thought about my grandmother, about Amara at her kitchen table, keeping 10,000 ghosts alive, refusing to let them become just a tragedy. I thought about the crew, not the tragedy, but the people, the way she'd made me learn them. The botanist with the seeds who thought something out there was glad they came. The doctor who volunteered at 70 because, he'd said, he wanted to be useful until the very end. The 2 teachers who married the week before launch and sailed into the dark on what was, in a way, their honeymoon. 10,000 people chosen for their character. The kindest, the wisest, the most curious humanity had. Doctors who spend their lives connecting to the suffering of strangers. Teachers who spend their lives joining their minds to the young. Diplomats who spend their lives standing in the space between peoples like me, like Saul. And I thought, if any people, any crew, any ship in the whole history of the galaxy could go into the Quiet and come out not a monster, if any beings could face whatever was in that dark and keep their souls, it would be them. It would be exactly them, because we didn't send our soldiers into the Quiet. We didn't send our worst, our hardest, our most walled off. We sent our best, our gentlest, our most full of love. We sent the love letter. And maybe, that was the one variable the Quiet had never encountered before. Maybe every other ship that went in had been crewed by beings ready to become monsters, and ours had been crewed by beings who were ready to become something else. I couldn't know, but I could choose what to bet on. And I looked at that beautiful glowing ship, and I heard that gentle voice still echoing in my ears, and I made the choice my grandmother would have made, the choice the Perdita's crew themselves would have made, the choice that was the whole reason humanity built that ship in the first place. The choice we'd made once already, as a species, when we decided to build a love letter instead of a weapon. I chose to reach out my hand. "It's not a monster," I told Administrator Saul. Voice shook, but I said it. "I can't prove it, nobody can, but I know who we put on that ship. We put the best of us. Not our soldiers, our doctors, our teachers, our gentlest people, the ones who spend their whole lives reaching across the distance between one soul and another. And I'm telling you, I'm staking my life and everyone's on it, that the best of us did not become a monster in the dark. Whatever's out there, it's not here to hurt us. It came home to help. Don't fire, please. Let them come home." Saul looked at me for a long, long moment. The protocol window ticking down. The other captains waiting. The whole galaxy's oldest fear balanced on the word of one human translator. And then he looked back out at the glowing ship. And he made his choice. And it was the bravest thing I ever saw anyone do. Because he had 60 years of fear and 11 governments, and every protocol in the book telling him to destroy it. And he set all of that aside on the word of one human, and the feeling underneath a message. "Hold fire," he said. "All ships, hold your fire, and open a channel to the Perdita." He keyed the override that would stop the automated protocol. I heard it, the sharp tone of a commander taking personal responsibility for stopping a thing that 60 years of law said must not be stopped. And then he turned to me. "You'll translate. You'll stand between us. That is your place, And this is the moment you were made for. And then quieter just to me, so the deck couldn't hear. I hope you are right, translator, because if you are wrong you have just killed us all, and I have just helped you do it. They brought the Perdita in slow. That was the agreement, worked out over the next several hours through me, standing in the middle, translating between a station full of terrified aliens and a ship full of, well, I didn't know yet what the ship was full of. Nobody did. That was the whole tension of it. We'd chosen not to destroy her, but choosing not to destroy something is not the same as trusting it, and Kesh was a station holding its breath, every weapon still hot, every escape route mapped, as the beautiful glowing ship came in from the dark toward us. I was the voice. That's how it worked. The Perdita spoke and I translated for Saul and the station and the fleet. The station spoke and I translated back. And it was the strangest conversation of my life, because on the one side I had a station full of beings braced for a monster, choosing their words like people negotiating with a bomb, and on the other side I had this voice. This warm, patient, gentle voice that answered every suspicious question with kindness, that never once took offense at being treated like a horror, that seemed to understand our fear completely and to forgive it completely, and that wanted, more than anything, to simply be allowed to come home and explain. The voice called itself the Perdita, not a crew member, the ship. I noticed that early and it unsettled me and I didn't understand it yet. When I asked to speak to the captain or to any crew member, the voice said gently, "That is part of what we have come home to explain. Please, be patient with us. It is a difficult thing to tell and we would rather tell it in person when you can see that we mean you no harm, but we will tell you everything, we promise. We have kept no secrets in 60 years, and we will keep none now. I have to tell you about those hours of bringing her in, because that's when the fear on the station slowly started to change. At first everyone was certain it was a trick, Administrator Sull included, maybe Sull most of all, because Sull was the one who'd be blamed if it was a trick, the one who'd set aside the protocol, the one whose career and conscience were riding on a gamble he'd made on my word. He questioned the Perdita relentlessly, through me, hour after hour. He tried to catch it in a lie. He asked it things only the real Perdita could know, and it answered them all. He asked it hostile things, insulting things, testing for the moment the gentle mask would slip and the monster would show through. It never slipped. That was the thing that started to work on people. Hour after hour, the Perdita endured suspicion and hostility and thinly veiled threats, and it never once responded with anything but patience and warmth. And you can fake a lot of things. You can fake a beautiful hull and a gentle message. But it is very, very hard to fake 6 hours of relentless hostile interrogation without a single crack, and slowly the beings on that station began to look at each other and wonder if maybe, the thing coming toward them was exactly what it said it was. There was a moment I'll never forget. A Threnody delegate, one of the precise, sticklish, deeply suspicious Threnody, asked the Perdita, through me, a cruel question. She asked it to describe, in detail, what had happened to the 10,000 human beings aboard. She asked it coldly, as a test, expecting the monster to reveal itself in how it spoke of the crew it had presumably consumed or replaced. And the Perdita was quiet for a moment, and then it said softly, "You are asking whether we killed them, whether we are wearing them. I understand why you ask. I will answer, but I ask you to prepare yourselves because the answer is sad and it is not what you expect and it is the heart of everything we have come home to tell you." A pause. The 10,000 are not dead, and they are not prisoners and they are not masks we wear. They are here, all of them. They are safe and they are well, and they have been well for 60 years. But they are not. They are no longer exactly what they were when they left, and neither am I. That is what the quiet does. That is the thing you have feared for 10,000 years, and you have feared it because you never understood it. May we please come home and show you. It is so much easier to show you than to tell you. And the Threnody delegate, the cold, suspicious, sticklish Threnody, had no answer, because that was not how a monster spoke. That was how something spoke that was carrying a grief and a wonder too large for words. They let her dock. It took a vote in the end. Sull convened the station's council, all the races represented, and they argued for an hour, and it was close, and what tipped it was something simple. The Perdita offered to come in unarmed and powered down. It offered to let the station's fleet keep every weapon trained on it. It offered to open its own hull, to let boarding teams come aboard first, before any crew emerged, to verify there was no threat. It offered, essentially, to make itself completely helpless, to put itself entirely at our mercy, as proof that it meant us no harm. A monster does not make itself helpless. That was the argument that won. Whatever else the Perdita was, it was willing to be at our mercy, and that single fact did more than 6 hours of gentle words to convince the council that the thing at their door was not the horror they'd feared. So they let her dock. And they sent a boarding team, armed, armored, terrified, but they sent them. And I went with them because I was the voice, because Sull wanted me there, because if there was going to be contact between the station and whatever the Perdita had become, it was going to happen through me. And I walked through the airlock of my grandmother's love letter, 60 years after it vanished, not knowing whether I was walking toward a reunion or toward my death. The inside of the Perdita was the most beautiful place I have ever been. I don't know how else to say it. The soft, warm light that glowed from her hull came from everywhere inside, gentle and golden, and the air was clean and sweet and smelled faintly of growing things, and there was a quiet to it, not an empty quiet but a full one, a restful one, the quiet of a place that is deeply and completely at peace. After 60 years in the dark, in the quiet, in the place where all the horrors came from, the inside of the Perdita felt like the safest place in the universe. It felt like being held. The boarding team felt it too. I watched these armored, terrified soldiers slowly lower their weapons, not because they'd decided to, but because it was almost impossible to hold fear in a place that felt so much like peace. And then we found the crew. They were in the great central chamber of the ship, the observation gallery that had been the Perdita's heart, the place where the diplomats and scientists had once gathered to look out at the stars. And they were there, all of them, 10,000 human beings, 60 years after they'd vanished. And they were changed. I need to describe this carefully, because it's the thing that everyone gets wrong, the thing the lie is built around. They weren't monsters. They weren't corrupted or twisted or dead, but they weren't quite human anymore either. They had changed the way that light changes when it passes through water, still themselves, still recognizably human in shape and face, but shot through now with something else, something luminous. Their skin had the same faint golden glow as the ship. Their eyes were deep and calm and held a kind of quiet that I'd never seen in any living being. They moved slowly, gently, peacefully, like the ship itself. And when they looked at us, these 10,000 changed humans looking at the terrified boarding team, they looked at us with a tenderness so complete, so total, that it was almost unbearable. They had become something between human and whatever the quiet was, and the something they'd become was not a horror. It was the opposite of a horror. It was the gentlest, most peaceful thing I have ever encountered. One of them came forward, an old woman, or something that had been an old woman and still was, and was also more. She came forward slowly, glowing softly, and she looked at me, at the human in the boarding team, and she smiled, and she said, out loud in a human voice, though I understood later that the Perdita's transmissions and the crew were all one thing now, all connected. She said, "You came, a human came. Oh, we hoped a human would come, we hoped so hard." And her eyes filled with tears, glowing tears, and she said, "You have to understand, we have missed you all so much, all of you, everyone we left behind. 60 years we've missed you. And we've been trying to come home the whole time, but we couldn't, not until we were ready, not until we understood what we'd become well enough to explain it without frightening you into destroying us." She reached out and took my hand. Her touch was warm, warmer than human, and it sent a feeling through me like the ship itself, like peace, like being held, and she said, "Let us tell you what happened. Let us tell you about the quiet. It's not what any of you think. It never was." Here is what she told me. Here is the truth about the quiet, the galaxy's oldest fear, the dark at the edge of the map. I'm going to tell it the way she told it to me, standing in the glowing heart of the Perdita, because it deserves to be told right. The quiet was not a place of death. It was a place of change. There was something out there in the deep dark beyond the settled galaxy. Not a monster, not a predator. Something older than that and stranger and gentler. Something that the changed woman didn't have words for, and neither do I, but the closest she could come was this. It was a presence. A vast, ancient, living presence that filled that region of space, that had been there since before the galaxy's first civilizations, and that had one nature, one quality, one thing it did to everything that entered it. It connected things, it joined them. It took the separateness that every living being carries, the loneliness, the walls between one mind and another, the fundamental isolation of being a single self locked inside a single skull, and it gently, gently dissolved it. Everything that entered the quiet became part of something larger, connected, joined, no longer alone. And that, the woman explained, was why the ships came out as monsters. Because think about it, she said. Think about who goes into the deep dark. For 10,000 years, who sailed their ships past the edge of the map into the quiet. Explorers, yes, but also war fleets. Also the desperate and the fleeing and the aggressive. Also beings whose civilizations were built on conquest, on separateness, on the hard walls between self and other. And when the quiet touched those beings, when it tried to join them, to connect them, to dissolve their loneliness, they fought it. They experienced the loss of their separateness as an attack, a violation, a horror. And they came out of the quiet twisted and broken, half connected and half fighting it, and the war inside them between the joining and the resisting turned them into exactly the monsters the galaxy feared. Not because the quiet was cruel. Because the quiet offered connection to beings who could only understand connection as annihilation. The quiet never made a monster, the woman said softly. It only ever offered to end loneliness. But if you fight that offer, if your whole self is built on being separate, on being walled off, on the hard boundary between you and everything else, then the ending of your loneliness feels like the ending of you, and you fight it. And the fighting is what breaks you. The fighting is what makes the monster. Every horror that ever came out of the quiet was a being who could not bear to be connected, torn apart by the offer of connection. And I understood, standing there, why the Perdita was different. Why humanity's ship, alone in 10,000 years, had come out of the quiet not as a monster but as this glowing, peaceful, tender thing. Because of who we'd put aboard her. You didn't send warriors, the woman said, and she was crying now, glowing tears running down her glowing face, and she was smiling through them. You didn't send conquerors or the walled off or the ones who could only understand themselves as separate. You sent your best, your kindest, your most curious. You sent doctors who spend their lives connecting to the suffering of strangers, teachers who spend their lives joining their minds to their students, diplomats who spend their lives standing in the space between peoples. You sent the 10,000 humans most capable of love, most practiced at reaching across the walls between self and other, most ready, though none of us knew it, for what the quiet offered. She squeezed my hand. When the quiet touched us, we didn't fight it. We couldn't have known to fight it, and it wasn't in us to fight it anyway, because we were the kind of people who'd spent our whole lives reaching out. So when the quiet offered to end our loneliness, to join us, to connect us, we said yes. All 10,000 of us. We said yes, and we let it happen, and we became this, connected to each other, to the ship, to the quiet itself, to the presence that lives there. We are 10,000 people who are also one thing, who are also part of something vast and ancient and kind, and we are not lonely anymore, and we have not been lonely for 60 years, and it is the most beautiful thing that has ever happened to anyone, and we came home to give it to you. To all of you. To the whole galaxy that has been so afraid, and so alone for so long." I couldn't speak. For a long moment I just stood there in the glowing heart of the ship, holding the hand of a changed woman, trying to hold the size of what she'd told me. And behind me the boarding team stood silent, having heard it too, having felt the peace of the ship soaking into them, and I could feel the whole story rearranging itself in my head. 60 years of grief, 60 years of galactic fear, all of it built on a misunderstanding so vast and so tragic that it took my breath away. The galaxy had feared the quiet for 10,000 years, and the quiet had only ever been offering to end their loneliness. And the reason it kept making monsters was that the galaxy kept sending it beings who would rather become monsters than stop being separate. The horror wasn't the quiet. The horror was the galaxy's own inability to accept connection. We'd been so afraid of losing ourselves that we'd turned the greatest gift in the universe into our deepest nightmare, over and over, for 10,000 years. And then humanity, small, late, unimportant humanity, had done the one thing no one else had ever done. We'd sent our best, and our best had said yes. But I finally managed. If it's so beautiful, if it's connection, if it's the end of loneliness, why did you wait 60 years to come home? Why not come back right away and tell us? And the woman's face grew grave and she said, "Because we knew what would happen if we came home too soon. We knew what the galaxy thought the quiet was. We knew that if we came back glowing and changed and speaking of connection, before we understood it well enough to explain it, before we could prove we meant no harm, they would destroy us. They would see a monster because that is all they had ever seen come out of the quiet, and they would destroy us before we could say a single word. So we waited. 60 years. We spent 60 years learning to be what we'd become, learning to explain it, learning to make ourselves gentle enough and clear enough and unthreatening enough that maybe, someone would hesitate long enough to listen." She looked at me. "And someone did, you did. A human stood in the space between and said, 'Don't fire, let them come home.' 60 years we waited and hoped for that one moment, and you gave it to us. Do you understand what you did? You gave 10,000 people their homecoming. You gave the whole galaxy the end of its oldest fear. You reached out your hand. But it wasn't over. That's the thing about this story. The beautiful revelation in the heart of the ship wasn't the end. Because there was still a station full of terrified beings out there, and a fleet with its weapons hot, and 11 governments that had spent 60 years preparing to destroy exactly this. And the news of what the Perdita had become was about to go out into a galaxy that was not, it turned out, entirely ready to hear it. Because here's the thing the woman told me next, the thing that turned wonder back into danger. "Not everyone will be glad," she said quietly. "You have to understand this before you go back out and tell them. There are powers in this galaxy who do not want the end of loneliness, who have built everything they are on separateness, on the walls between peoples, on fear, on the hard boundaries that let them rule. The quiet is a threat to them, not because it's a monster. Because it isn't, because it offers something that would dissolve the very thing their power is built on. A connected galaxy, a joined galaxy, a galaxy that is no longer lonely and no longer afraid. That is a galaxy that cannot be ruled the way they rule it now. And they know it. They have always known it. That is the real reason the quiet has been feared for 10,000 years. Her glowing eyes were sad. The monsters were real, yes, but the monsters were convenient. They gave the powers that rule this galaxy a reason to keep everyone afraid of the one thing that could set them free. And now, we have come home to prove the monsters were never the truth. And those powers are going to do everything they can to stop us. Because we are not a threat to the galaxy. We are a threat to the people who rule it. And that is a far more dangerous thing to be." And as if the universe itself had been waiting for her to say it, the Perdita's connection to the station flared, and I felt it through the woman's hand, through the ship, through the strange new connection that was already, faintly, beginning to touch even me. I felt a warning ripple through the whole ship, and the woman's face went still and she said, "They're here already, faster than we hoped. The ones who rule through fear, They've sent a fleet. A real one, not the Perdita Protocol fleet that was just the automated response. This is deliberate. This is the powers who do not want us to be heard, coming to make sure we never get the chance to explain. They're going to destroy us and the station and everyone on it, and they're going to call it Containing the Quiet's Monster. And the galaxy will believe them because the galaxy has believed them for 10,000 years. She gripped my hand hard. You have to go back. You have to warn them. And you have to help us do the one thing that can stop this, not fight them. We won't fight. We can't fight. That's not what we are anymore. We have to show them. All of them. The whole fleet, the whole station, everyone. We have to show them the truth so completely and so undeniably that not even the powers who rule through fear can make them unsee it. We have one chance, and we need a human to stand in the middle again. We need you. I looked at her, at the 10,000 glowing, peaceful faces behind her, at the most beautiful thing that had ever come out of the dark. And out there, beyond the hull, a fleet was coming to destroy it, sent by the powers who needed the galaxy to stay afraid. And I understood that the moment I'd been made for wasn't over. It was just beginning. I ran back through the Perdita to the airlock, and the boarding team ran with me, and behind us the 10,000 glowing faces watched us go with that unbearable tenderness. And I burst back onto the station and found Administrator Saul, and I told him everything. All of it, the quiet, the connection, the end of loneliness, the truth about the monsters, that they were beings who couldn't bear to stop being separate, torn apart by the offer of connection. And the crew, the 10,000 humans who'd said yes because they were the best of us, the kindest, the ones most ready to reach across the walls between self and other. I told him the Perdita was not a monster. I told him it was the answer. And I told him that a fleet was coming, a deliberate fleet, sent by the powers that ruled through fear, to destroy it before the galaxy could learn the truth. Saul listened, this grave ancient Ordini who'd already staked everything on my word once, and when I finished he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, I believe you. God help me, I believe you. I felt it too, the message, when it first came. There was something in it no monster could send. He straightened. But believing you and stopping a fleet are different things. Who is coming? Tell me exactly who is coming. And I told him the name the Perdita had given me. And Saul went pale, or the Ordini equivalent of pale, and he said, the Concordance. I have to explain the Concordance, because they're the real antagonist of this whole story, more than the quiet ever was. The Concordance was the closest thing the settled galaxy had to a ruling power. Not an empire, they were subtler than that. They were a coordinating body, a coalition of the oldest and most powerful races who managed the galaxy's affairs, kept the peace, ran the great institutions that let 100 species share the stars. And on the surface they were benevolent. Order, stability, the thing that kept the galaxy from tearing itself apart. But underneath, the Concordance ruled the way all such powers rule, through fear and through division, and through keeping everyone separate and afraid and dependent. They kept the races apart, managed, mediated, never quite allowed to fully trust each other, because a galaxy of peoples who didn't trust each other was a galaxy that needed the Concordance to hold it together. They ruled the space between peoples, and they made sure that space stayed wide and cold and full of fear, because that fear was the foundation of their power. And the greatest fear of all, the deepest and most useful, was the quiet, the monster at the edge of the map, the horror in the dark. For 10,000 years, the Concordance had used the quiet to keep the galaxy afraid, and the fear of the quiet had been one of the great pillars holding up their rule. And now the Perdita had come home to knock that pillar down, to prove the monster was never real, to offer the galaxy the one thing the Concordance could never allow, connection, the end of the loneliness and division and fear that the Concordance ruled through, a galaxy joined to itself, unafraid, no longer needing anyone to hold it together because it would be holding itself. The Concordance could not allow the Perdita to be heard. And so they'd sent a fleet, dressed up as a containment operation, to destroy the ship and the station and everyone aboard, and to make sure the truth about the quiet died in the dark where it had always been kept. "How long?" Sul asked me. "The Perdita says hours," I told him. "Maybe less, they're coming fast." Sul was already moving, already thinking, and I saw in him the same thing I'd seen when he chose not to fire. A being who'd spent his whole life inside the Concordance's order, who'd served it, who'd believed in it, and who was now, in the space of a single day, having to decide whether it had all been a lie. "The station's fleet is the Perdita Protocol fleet," he said. "A dozen races. When the Concordance arrives, they'll order us to help destroy the ship, and most of these captains will obey, because obeying the Concordance is what they've done their whole lives." He looked at me. "We cannot fight the Concordance. Even if every ship here turned, we could not win a battle against what they'll send, so we will not fight." He echoed, without knowing it, what the Perdita had said. "We will do the other thing. The thing your ship suggested. We will show them the truth, all of them. So completely that not even the Concordance can make them unsee it." A grim, almost smile. "You had better hope your glowing ship knows how to do that, because it is the only weapon we have." The Perdita did know how to do it. That was the plan we built, in the hours we had, standing in the middle, me between the ship and the station, translating, coordinating, the space between peoples where I'd spent my whole life, suddenly the most important place in the galaxy. Here was the plan. The Concordance's whole power rested on keeping the galaxy separate, on the walls between minds, between peoples, between self and other. The fear, the division, the loneliness, that was the foundation. And the Perdita was, by its very nature, the dissolution of exactly that. The crew were connected to each other, to the ship, to the quiet, to the vast, gentle presence that lived in the dark. And that connection could reach out, gently, without force. It could offer itself to anyone nearby, the way it had faintly begun to touch me in the heart of the ship. So we would not fight the Concordance's fleet. We would offer it connection, every being aboard every ship. The whole fleet, the whole station, everyone. The Perdita would open itself and extend the thing it had become, not forcing it on anyone, never forcing. That was the whole point. That was the difference between the Perdita and a monster, but offering it. Letting every being in range feel, just for a moment, what the crew had felt. The end of loneliness. The connection. The truth of the quiet, experienced directly, undeniably from the inside. "They can't unsee that," the Perdita told me, through the connection that was growing stronger between us. "The Concordance can lie about a monster. They've lied about the quiet for 10,000 years, but they cannot lie about a feeling that every being in the fleet experiences for themselves, all at once in their own hearts. Once you have felt the end of your own loneliness, no one can convince you it was a horror. The Concordance rules through fear of the unknown. We will make it known, and their power over it will end." It was a gamble. Of course it was a gamble. If the Concordance's fleet fired the instant they arrived, before the Perdita could reach them, it would all be over. But it was the only move we had, and it was, I realized, the most human move imaginable. The Perdita, humanity's love letter to the universe, ending the galaxy's oldest tyranny not with a weapon but with an outstretched hand. Exactly what we'd built her to do. 60 years late and changed beyond recognition, and still at the core of her, doing the one thing humanity had sent her out to do, reaching out. The Concordance fleet arrived exactly when the Perdita said it would. And it was enormous. I stood on the observation deck of Kesh and watched them come out of the dark. Not the ragtag Perdita Protocol fleet, but the real might of the Concordance. Warships vast and cold and ancient. More firepower than I'd known existed. Enough to reduce the station and the Perdita and everyone aboard to dust in a matter of seconds. They came in a tight formation, weapons already charging, and they did not hail us, and they did not slow down, and I understood that they had come to do exactly what the Perdita had warned, to destroy the truth before it could be spoken, and to call it safety. The Concordance did hail, finally, but not to talk. A single cold transmission, to the station and the Perdita Protocol fleet. The vessel designated Perdita is a confirmed quiet contamination event. Under Concordance authority, it is to be destroyed immediately, along with any assets it has contacted. All Protocol fleet vessels will assist. This is not a negotiation. Comply or be classified as contaminated yourselves. And there it was, the threat bare and cold. Help us destroy the ship and everyone it's touched, which now included the station and me and the boarding team and anyone who'd heard the truth, or be destroyed alongside us. The Concordance wasn't just going to kill the Perdita. They were going to kill everyone who'd learned what it really was, because the truth was the real contamination they feared. I watched the Perdita Protocol fleet waver. A dozen races, a dozen captains, all of them facing the choice Sol had already made and I had already made. Obey the power they'd served their whole lives, or gamble everything on a glowing ship and a feeling. And I saw some of them begin to turn toward the Perdita, weapons charging, ready to obey. Because that's what fear does. That's what 10,000 years of Concordance rule had built. When the moment came, most beings did as they were told. Now, I said to the Perdita through the connection through the space between. It has to be now, before they fire, now. And the Perdita opened. I don't have adequate words for what happened next. I've tried for the rest of my life, and I always fall short. But I'll tell you what it was like from the inside, because I was inside it, connected as I was, standing in the middle as I'd always stood. The Perdita extended itself, all of it. 60 years of connection, 10,000 joined souls, the vast gentle presence of the quiet channeled through them. It reached out all at once and touched every mind in range, every being on the station, every being in the Perdita Protocol fleet, and every being in the Concordance fleet. Thousands upon thousands of minds, alien and human, soldier and civilian, ruler and ruled, all of them, in a single instant, offered the thing the crew had been offered 60 years before in the dark. The end of loneliness. And I felt it happen. I felt it ripple out from the ship and touch mind after mind after mind, and I felt each one react. And here is the thing. Here is the beautiful, terrible, hopeful thing at the very center of this whole story. Most of them said yes. Not all. Some fought it the way the monsters had fought it, the walled off and the frightened and the ones who could only understand connection as annihilation. But most, the vast overwhelming most, when they were offered gently without force, the end of the loneliness they'd carried their whole lives without even knowing they carried it, when they felt for one instant what it was to be joined instead of separate, to be held instead of alone. They said yes, they wept and they said yes. Thousands of them all at once, across the whole fleet and the whole station, soldiers dropping their weapons and weeping, ancient beings who'd served the Concordance for 1,000 years suddenly feeling, for the first time, that they were not alone and had never needed to be. The truth of the quiet, experienced directly, undeniably, in 10,000 hearts at once. And the Concordance's power broke, in that single instant, because you cannot rule through fear of the unknown once the unknown has been felt and found to be gentle. You cannot keep a galaxy separate once it has tasted connection. You cannot make beings afraid of the end of their own loneliness once they have felt how much they longed for it all along. The Concordance fleet did not fire. It couldn't. The beings who crewed it had just felt the truth in their own hearts, and they could not fire on it. The cold transmission came again, the Concordance command ordering the fleet to attack, and the fleet did not obey. For the first time in 10,000 years, the fleet did not obey. Because obedience is built on fear and separation, and the fear and separation had just dissolved all at once in the light of the Perdita. I watched it happen from the observation deck. I watched the greatest fleet in the galaxy, sent to destroy the truth, simply stop, power down its weapons, drift. Thousands of beings aboard it sitting in the sudden overwhelming realization that everything they'd been told, everything they'd served, everything they'd been afraid of, had been a lie built to keep them alone. And I watched the Concordance's rule end, not with a battle, not with a weapon, but with an outstretched hand and a galaxy that finally took it. The Perdita had come home, and the universe had realized all at once, in a single shared instant of connection, that it had been a mistake to fear her, that it had always been a mistake, that the thing they'd feared for 10,000 years was the very thing they'd been longing for all along. I want to tell you about the aftermath, because it matters, and because it wasn't simple, and I promised you the true version and not the comfortable one. The concordance didn't vanish overnight. Powers like that never do. There were those among them, the ones who'd fought the connection, the walled-off ones, who fled, who regrouped, who spent years trying to rebuild the old order of fear. There were hard times. There was a long, difficult transition, as a galaxy that had been ruled through division for 10,000 years slowly, painfully, learned to govern itself as something connected. Connection isn't a magic wand. It doesn't solve everything. Peoples who are joined still disagree, still struggle, still have to do the hard work of building something better. The end of loneliness was a beginning, not an ending. But the pillar had fallen. The great lie was broken. The galaxy knew the truth about the quiet now, that it had never been a monster, that it had only ever been offering the thing everyone most needed, and you cannot unknow a thing like that. Ship after ship began to sail into the quiet on purpose now, crewed by beings ready to say yes. And they came home changed and glowing and gentle, and the number of the connected grew, and the old fear withered, and slowly, over years, the galaxy became something it had never been in all its long history. Less afraid, less alone. And it started with humanity. That's the part I hold on to. Small, late, unimportant humanity who nobody took seriously, who got the bad trade routes and the seats at the back of every room. We were the ones who did it. Not because we were strong, not because we were clever, but because when we built a ship to sail into the dark, we filled it with our best, our kindest, our most curious, our most full of love. And when the dark offered them the end of their loneliness, they were the ones, alone in 10,000 years, who were ready to say yes. The galaxy feared our love letter, and our love letter turned out to be exactly what it always said it was. A love letter, the most powerful thing in the universe in the end, more powerful than every fleet the Concordance ever built. The changed woman found me again, after. The one who'd taken my hand in the heart of the ship. She found me on the observation deck of Kesh, in the quiet after everything, when the fleets had gone still, and the galaxy was beginning to understand what had happened to it. And she stood beside me at the viewport, glowing softly, and we looked out at the Perdita together, at humanity's love letter finally home. "You could join us," she said gently. "You felt it, you're already halfway there, you have been since the heart of the ship. You could say yes fully and never be alone again. All of us would welcome you. You most of all, the one who stood in the middle, the one who reached out your hand." She smiled. "It's the most beautiful thing there is, and you've earned it more than anyone." And I thought about it, I really did. I'd felt it, the connection, the end of loneliness, and it was everything she said, and part of me wanted it so badly it ached. But I said no. I want to tell you why I said no, because it's the last thing, and it's the thing the story is really about. I said no because someone has to stand in the middle. The galaxy was connected now, more and more of it every day. But not all of it. There were still the walled-off ones, the frightened ones, the ones who couldn't yet say yes and maybe never would. There were still peoples who hadn't been touched, worlds that hadn't heard, beings for whom the connection was still a terror rather than a gift. And there would be, for a long time, a galaxy half joined and half separate. And in that galaxy, there would need to be people who could stand in the space between, who understood both sides, who could translate between the connected and the alone, between the changed and the unchanged, between those who'd said yes and those who were still too afraid. That was my whole life, the space between, the translator, and the galaxy needed that more than ever now in the long work of bringing everyone home who wanted to come, gently, without force, one frightened separate soul at a time. "If I join you," I told the changed woman, "then I'm on one side, And the galaxy has enough people on their own sides. What it needs, what it's always needed, what humanity was built to be, is someone in the middle. Reaching out a hand to the connected and the alone both. That's the work, that's my work. Someone has to do it, and I've spent my whole life learning how. I smiled at her. You said it yourself. I'm the one who stood in the middle. Let me keep standing there. Let me be the hand that reaches out for as long as there's anyone still too afraid to take it. And the changed woman looked at me for a long moment, with those deep, glowing, peaceful eyes. And then she nodded, and she understood, because of course she understood. They understood everything now. Then that is your gift to us, she said softly. The rest of us said yes and were joined. You will say not yet and stay in the middle and spend your life reaching out. And that too is a kind of connection, maybe the bravest kind. The kind that stays separate on purpose so that it can reach the ones who are still alone. She took my hand one last time, and the warmth of the whole connected galaxy flowed through it, and then she let go. Reach out your hand, translator, for all of us, for as long as you can, and know that we are always here on the other side of the middle, holding the door open for everyone you send our way. I'm an old woman now telling you this. I stayed in the middle my whole life exactly like I said I would. I spent it reaching out to the frightened and the walled off, to the peoples who hadn't heard, to every separate lonely soul still too afraid to take the hand the galaxy was offering. I sent so many of them home, one at a time, gently, without force. Which is the only way it ever works. The galaxy is different now, less afraid, less alone. The quiet is not a monster anymore. It's a destination, a homecoming, the place you go when you're finally ready to stop being alone. The concordance is gone, its rule of fear a fading memory. And it all started with a ship that vanished into the dark and came home 60 years later, glowing and gentle and changed, carrying the answer to a question the galaxy had been too afraid to ask. They feared our love letter. For 60 years, 11 governments kept their fleets ready to destroy it. And when it finally came home, it didn't destroy anything. It didn't even fight. It just opened its hand and offered the whole terrified, lonely galaxy the one thing it had always needed and never dared to hope for. The end of being alone. That's who we were in the end. Not the monsters they feared, not the weapon they braced for. Just a young, small, unimportant people who'd sailed into the dark carrying the best of ourselves, and who came home to prove that the thing everyone feared in the black was never a horror at all. It was only ever an outstretched hand. And all we ever had to do was take it.